Bibliophiles of the internet, my name's Adriana, and today I'm here to give you 5 reasons to read the upcoming release Cantoras by Carolina de Robertis. This is an Own Voices queer Latinx historical fiction story set in Uruguay during the 1970s when a military government was in place. Because of that military dictatorship, to be queer basically became a criminal act punishable by imprisonment or worse. Despite that, the 5 queer women at the heart of this story find each other and find this isolated stretch of beach, Cabo Polonio, which they claim as a sort of sanctuary where they can just be themselves. The story follows them as they move back and forth between their hometown of Montevideo and Cabo Polonio and how they are tested time and time again by families, lovers, society, and each other as they try to just live their authentic lives. This story does contain triggers for peripheral mentions of rape, the criminalization of queerness, systemic homophobia, brief descriptions of miscarriage, and brief descriptions of the medical conversion therapy process and its effects. Reason number 1 to read this book. This story is a celebration of queer women and queer desire in all its forms. I mean, let's just start with how groundbreaking this story is to have multiple queer characters who share the same identities and the same desires in one place. I love queer lit, but sometimes it seems like we're only allowed to have 1 or 2 prominent queer characters in one story before cutting off the quota, and so often, if there is more than one queer character, the other is regulated to being a love interest. But in this book, that is definitely not the case. Obviously, this story is set amidst a governmental dictatorship, and it does realistically explore the social and political consequences of being queer in those circumstances, but these characters also make space to celebrate their desires. I think it would be all too easy to fall into the rhetoric of historical accuracy and to make these characters feel ashamed or think about how their existence is inherently sinful or evil, but here we have queer women who are powerful sexual beings who view pleasuring other women to be the highest form of worship there is. And especially when they're visiting Cabo Polonio, they're free to tease each other about their sexual exploits. They're free to bring their lovers or talk about experiences they've had or experiences they want to have, and it's really wonderful to see that on the page. For example, there's a moment when Baz is thinking, forget a good education, forget finding a stable job. When I grow up, I want to know how to pleasure a woman. And that is such a moment. Each of these characters, each of these voices are distinctive, and each represents a valid form of queer existence. Reason number 2, this story explores not only being queer, but actively queering different modes of existence, communication, and even language itself. I bring this up because the title of this book itself is a fun, self-made queer perversion of language because cantoras means singers when you just translate it straight. But it's actually a made-up slang term these characters create to telegraph queerness because it conjures up the image of a woman who sings, and they're playing off all those connotations. I believe they came up with it when 2 of the cantoras went off together to make love, and the others were teasing them about how they made each other sing, and the term definitely plays on that energy. I talked about this in my June wrap-up, but this story gets you thinking about how cantoras in this context really means women who sing, women who are alive and vibrant, who are joyful, women whose songs are heard and felt. And if a person is singing, then by definition, they are not silent. As we go through these women's lives and they retain this use of language, it made me think about what is song and what is the act of singing itself. Singing is an act of passion and emotion. It's a mode of expression that cannot simply be communicated with words. Voices are lifted in song, and so are the voices of these women similarly lifted by this found family of their own creation and by mutual acceptance. These women live and survive by refusing to assimilate in so many ways, and by taking what the world has given them, like language, and making it work within the context of their own lives. Reason number 3, this story retroactively restores a sense of agency and power to queer Latinx women living in a time that tried to render them powerless. First of all, I just appreciate that Carolina de Robertis has dedicated herself to creating stories that show that queer folks have always existed, because to acknowledge that history in itself is a powerful statement. I think one of the best illustrations of the restoration of agency is the parallel between being disappeared by the government and these cantoras willingly disappearing from society's judgmental gaze. These cantoras are not allowed to be out and proud. They're not allowed to be visible and showcase themselves, so they go in the other direction and find a safe space that's away from society's prying eyes. But what makes that act significant is that it's their choice. They find Cabo Polonio for themselves. They find this horribly rundown shack for sale by themselves. They scrape together the money to buy it for themselves. They furnish it themselves. They make the pilgrimage to spend time in a place where they can just breathe and exist for themselves. The truth is that there's no handbook for how they should survive. There's no set path. There's no one to look to as an example, so their only option is to figure it out themselves and to not let anyone or anything dictate those choices. And there are so many circumstances and moments when they could easily collapse beneath the weight and the consequences of that choice, but they don't. Reason number 4 is that this story shows that queer resistance exists within moments of quietness, in found families, and in the painstaking creation of safe spaces. Again, it is an act of queer resistance just to exist and to live in a way that shows that you will not go quietly into that good night, and that can take on so many different forms. In this day and age, there's social media, there's protest, there's activism, there's people with platforms making statements, there's people creating queer content, but these cantoras obviously don't have access to many of those things. What they do have is the ability to gather in one place and listen to each other's stories, because allowing our stories to be told and held in someone else's heart is an act of resistance. Just by showing up for each other and being present, they are freeing each other from their burdens and their secrets. And this is totally because I reread the Song of Achilles just before I read this book, but it took me back to those images of Patroclus waiting for Achilles to return from the battlefield no matter how late it was, because it was important for him to listen to Achilles' stories and to quote-unquote make him human again by releasing him from his demons. That is very much in line with the spirit of this book, and how just by sitting together around a fire, these cantoras allow each other to feel whatever it is they feel without fear of reproach, because being unafraid to tell your truth is resistance. But also through their connection and by sharing their experiences, these cantoras also give each other purpose. For example, these women pass on their knowledge to each other, and there's times when, like Flaca, a butcher's daughter, teaches Baz how to butcher meat. Baz would never have learned that if they were not connected through this community, if they were not able to exist together within this space. Being queer is not just about falling in love or having sexual experiences. The amount of emotional exchange and acceptance to be found in the community and in this found family is often defined in quieter terms. And the way these cantoras resist is by recognizing that their story of just existing is worth telling, that it serves a purpose simply because it is theirs. Their whole philosophy is that safe is what you make with your own hands, which they exemplify time and time again throughout this book. And finally, reason number 5 is that for every victory, for every step forward, for every moment of validation, we feel the weight of those we've lost in the process. And these cantoras show how we have to live our lives in a way that honors that loss. As I've said, while this is a largely vibrant, unapologetic, celebratory narrative that offers so much validation and moments of queer joy, it does realistically explore how this time period left a mark of trauma and loss. But it's also powerful and sobering in reminding us that evolution and change are always inevitably foreshadowed by loss. There's people we lose along the way, people who are taken from us in so many different capacities, versions of ourselves that we have to leave behind if we are to survive and be true to ourselves. Not everybody gets to see what lies on the other side, and as morbid as that sounds, we have to acknowledge that truth. But instead of wallowing in that despair, these characters learn to use it as a means to move forward, because even more than they fear being forcibly silenced, the fear of not being themselves and not living their true life drastically outpaces any of that. Just as we in the present day are parsing this queer historical narrative and how people like these cantoras pave the way, it's important to acknowledge the people who came before us, the people who didn't make it, because it's also an act of resistance to not allow our history to be erased. These cantoras endure hardships, they endure loss, but that suffering does not define the limits of their existence. In fact, I would say that's what spurs these cantoras to deliberately carve out these safe spaces, to commit themselves to this found family, and to make their little corner of the world a better and more loving place. So those are just 5 reasons among many to add this absolute game-changing book to your to-be-read list. If your interest in this story is now piqued, or if you know of any other queer Latinx historical fiction books that you would recommend, feel free to sound off in the comments. But that's everything I had for this review and recommendation today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you on the flip side of the page.